Selma marked the turning point in the struggle to secure the ballot. 5 months after the marchers reached Montgomery, the most important civil rights legislation in a century, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was signed into law. Behold, here cometh the dreamer.
And we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our business. I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. We will fill our legislative hall. One day, this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
And the murder of 2 civil rights workers prompt President Lyndon Johnson to propose federal legislation to eliminate barriers to black registration and voting.
This law is not an effort to punish or coerce anyone. Its object is one which no American in his heart can truly reject. It is to give all our people the right to choose their leaders. To deny this right, I think, is to deny democracy itself.
Congress passes the Voting Rights Act, which permits the Attorney General to send federal examiners to register blacks in any county that discriminates against them.
Wherever, by clear and objective standards, states and counties are using regulations or laws or tests to deny the right to vote, then they will be struck down. If it is clear that state officials still intend to discriminate, then federal examiners will be sent in to register all eligible voters. When the prospect of discrimination is gone, the examiners will be immediately withdrawn. And under this act, if any county anywhere in this nation does not want federal intervention, it need only open its polling places to all of its people.
President Johnson signs the landmark legislation on August 6, 1965. The Voting Rights Act is not just a victory for black Americans. In the words of Martin Luther King, Jr., it enriches the lives of all Americans.
It is an axiom of nonviolent action and democracy that when any group struggles properly and justly to achieve its own rights, it enlarges the rights of all.
President Johnson addresses a joint session of Congress to push a voting rights bill aimed at ending discrimination. It would appoint federal voting registrars in some instances and put an end to complicated literacy tests and other hampering tactics. The president referred to the events in Selma as an American tragedy. And throughout the nation, even in Canada, there were marches through the streets of towns and cities. In New York's Harlem, more than 15,000, half of them white, filed somberly through the streets in quiet but agonized protest. The events in Selma had been brought to a climax by a nighttime attack on a white Boston minister by white men. He died 2 days later, many feeling he suffered martyrdom in the cause of civil rights and voting discrimination. The next day, 4 men were held for his murder. For the Reverend James J. Reeb, the demonstrators write his epitaph with this tribute. Selma sprang overnight from an obscure southern town to the front pages of world newspapers. This church was headquarters in the Negro drive for the right to vote, and it was here that Martin Luther King came to lend his support to the campaign. He pointed out that from Selma's 14,000 Negroes, only a few more than 300 had been registered at the polls. When one group set out to march to the Capitol at Montgomery, the procession was broken up violently by state troopers and sheriff's deputies. Then Dr. King led another contingent through the town. This time there is no violence. The 1,000 Negroes and 400 white ministers and civil rights workers reach the end of the bridge where the cordon of troopers stand. They are ordered to turn back. Dr. King confers with the police as the marchers hold their ground. He requests that they be allowed to pray. There are a few minutes of mounting tension. The request to pray is granted, and they kneel in the streets. Informants say that Dr. King turned his marchers at the behest of the White House, an arrangement that had been made in advance to avoid a confrontation that could only end in bloodshed. The troops and deputies stand stolidly by as the prayers are said and the marchers go back to Selma. This Alabama town will go down in the history books as a turning point in the civil rights drive. From the halls of Congress to the smallest crossroads hamlet, people can understand the plea that no American can have freedom and justice unless there is freedom and justice for all. In Selma, there is a lesson to be learned.
Write this first line commencing on at this word and ending at that word.
How was that? Say that again. Write this first word.
Write this first line beginning with that word and ending with that word. All right, now read this entire paragraph commencing with this word and ending with that word.
Protection to person and property is the following duty of government and shall be approved and completed.
What's this word here?
In practice.
Again?
In practice.
Well, that's the only word you missed. What's your last name?
Sanders.
What is it?
Sanders. S-A-N-D-E-R-S.
S-A-N-D-E-R-S. Your first name?
Eli.
1st District, 9th Precinct. 1st District, 9th Precinct will be published in the paper a few days before an election. You just want to remember the 1st District, 9th Precinct. Papers will tell you where the voting place is. That's all.
Thank you.
Tired of having the worst schools. The way you're going to change these things will be to go all out to get the right to vote.
of nation. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such an issue. And should we defeat every enemy rooted in democracy, the most basic right of all was the right to choose your own leaders. The history of this country, in large measure, is the history of expansion of that right to all of our people. Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult. But about this, there can and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. Then the duty we have to ensure that right. Yet the harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Every device of which human ingenuity is capable has been used to deny this right. The Negro citizen may go to register only to be told that the day is wrong, or the hour is late, or the official in charge is absent. And if he persists, and if he manages to present himself to the registrar, he may be disqualified because he did not spell out his middle name, or because he abbreviated a word on the application. And if he manages to fill out an application, he is given a test. The registrar is the sole judge of whether he passes this test. He may be asked to recite the entire Constitution or explain the most complex provisions of state law. And even a college degree cannot be used to prove that he can read and write. For the fact is that the only way to pass these barriers is to show a white skin. This bill will strike down restrictions to voting in all elections. Federal, state, and local. Which have been used to deny Negroes the right to vote. This bill will establish a simple, uniform standard which cannot be used, however ingenious the effort to flout our Constitution. It will provide for citizens to be registered by officials of the United States government.
President Johnson sends to Congress a bill to reinforce the right to vote. With Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, the President signs an accompanying letter to the legislators urging swift passage for the bill that would outlaw discriminatory practices. Then the Attorney General briefs the press on the salient features of the bill. It would give his office the power to appoint federal registrars in 6 southern states where literacy and other voter qualification tests are required. The bill's aim is to bring to fruition the goal of minority groups that have staged protests throughout the nation. This is a demonstration in Montgomery, Alabama, led by Dr. Martin Luther King. In contrast to the violence of many marches, this one is held peacefully with police blessing and under permit. The day before, the marchers had been dispersed by state troopers and sheriff's deputies when they marched without a permit. Today, troopers and deputies are absent. Only city police line the route of march. parade passes through the heart of Montgomery, past the state capitol, to the county courthouse a mile from the starting point. The only sign of disorder was the blowing of horns by impatient motorists. Not a club was raised in anger. The throng later hears Dr. King summarize a meeting he had with the county sheriff. He said that they were near agreement on future demonstrations, and he saw peace in Montgomery.
Bring about a change in the very structure of Alabama laws with reference to voter registration. And we look forward in the not too distant future to having all of these people on the books as registered voters.
In March 1965, the Reverend Martin Luther King led two dramatic marches from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The marchers were met with violence at the hands of segregationist forces, but they reached their goal. As they massed in front of Alabama's state capitol on March 25, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson had already called for a new voting rights law.
Wherever there is discrimination, this law will strike down all restrictions used to deny the people the right to vote. It will establish a simple, uniform standard which cannot be used, however ingenious the effort, to flaunt our Constitution. And if state officials refuse to cooperate, then citizens will be registered by federal officials.
There were demonstrations of support in many parts of the nation. The Voting Rights Bill was enacted into law on August 6, 1965.
And to protect the rights of black citizens.
Wherever, by clear and objective standards, states and counties are using regulations or laws or tests to deny the right to vote, then they will be struck down.
Martin Luther
remain. And in 1965, King turned his attention to Selma, Alabama, and Negro voting rights. Here, as in many places in the South, voter registers designed to keep Negro voting to a minimum. Difficult literacy tests were administered by white officials, and Negroes who attempted to register were often harassed.
As the movement and its lawyers turn their attention to the issue of equal voting rights, Wallace feels especially threatened. He knows that a large black vote in Alabama could profoundly alter the
to make it a fact. As a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are. But really, it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Marking 1964 as a historic year in race relations, on July 2nd, President Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act. It was the strongest federal law since the slaves were freed a century ago.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then, he wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who have labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
There's warm applause from members of both parties as the president sets to work. It is work. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. Souvenirs go to Republican leader Everett Dirksen and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey. The president seems to have mastered the art of just touching each pen to the paper. Integration leader Martin Luther King receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish. The Department of Justice will enforce the law if necessary, and G-Man Chief J. Edgar Hoover is present. Another group of pens is reserved for the Kennedys, and the Attorney General is entrusted with a half dozen. Now, in this summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill is the law of the land. In the words of the President, it restricts no one's freedom so long as he respects the rights of others.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
1 year has passed. Where has it gone? What has and what has not been done during that year which held such great promise?